When I chose a different spiritual path, my family called it betrayal, but what I found behind their insistence to bring me back was a deep generational secret of fear, silence, and pain, a story they never wanted me to know, and one that changed everything. My name's Emily, I'm 37 years old, and this is the story of how walking away from the religion I was raised in felt like ripping a wound open in my family, but it ended up uncovering something nobody ever talked about, something heavy buried under decades of fear and silence. So it all started about 2 years ago when I finally decided I couldn't live a lie anymore. I was raised in a strict evangelical household. My parents, David, 62, and Karen, 60, were the kind of people who believed that faith was the only path to salvation and anything else was dangerous, and my two younger siblings, Jake, 34, and Sarah, 30, were just as deeply involved. Sunday mornings were like clockwork, church 3 times a week, Bible study, prayer groups, all that stuff. I went along for years, even when doubts crept in quietly, because honestly, it was easier than rocking the boat, but there was this growing emptiness inside me, a feeling like I was living someone else's life and hiding who I really was under layers of righteousness. So I started exploring other spiritual paths quietly, reading about meditation, mindfulness, even dabbling in a bit of Buddhism and secular spirituality. I kept it to myself because I knew how they'd react. My family saw anything outside our faith as betrayal, a rejection not just of God but of them. It felt like treason in their eyes. And when I finally told them I was stepping away from the religion completely and wanted nothing to do with the church anymore, the fallout was immediate and brutal. My mom cried for days, begging me to come back. My dad was furious, calling me selfish and lost. My siblings looked at me like I had committed a crime. They cut me out of group chats, stopped inviting me to family dinners. It was like I went from being their beloved daughter and sister to a ghost they pretended didn't exist, and honestly, it crushed me because I wanted so badly for us to understand each other, but it seemed impossible, and so began months of cold silence and awkward phone calls until one day, something unexpected happened. My mom called me herself, but instead of the usual pleading tone, there was this tiredness in her voice, almost like she was finally ready to talk honestly. She told me about her own mother, my grandmother Ruth, and how she'd been forced into the same church under pressure from her family, how she never felt free to express doubts or pain, how she suffered in silence for decades because speaking up meant exile. And as my mom told me this story, I realized the family's fierce grip on religion wasn't just about faith, it was about survival, about hiding trauma and fear under a veneer of holiness. My parents and grandparents passed down this legacy of silence and conformity to protect themselves from judgment and rejection, but in doing so, they built walls so high no one could ever truly be free, and suddenly I saw everything in a new light. Their insistence to bring me back wasn't just about religion. It was about their fear of breaking that fragile family unity and exposing painful secrets they never wanted out. The more I listened, the more I understood the heavy cost of generations trapped in a cycle of fear and repression, and that's when I decided that leaving the faith didn't have to mean breaking my family. It could be a chance to heal, to speak the truths that were buried for so long, but I knew it wouldn't be easy, because unraveling years of silence means shaking the very foundation of who they believed themselves to be. And that was the beginning of a long, messy, but ultimately hopeful journey. After that phone call with my mom, something shifted in me. I realized that if I wanted to bridge the gap with my family, I needed to dig deeper into those unspoken stories and confront the shadows lurking beneath our family's perfect religious facade. So I started asking more questions, carefully at first, like dipping my toes into cold water. I reached out to my Aunt Linda, Ruth's sister, who I'd barely ever talked to before. She was hesitant at first, but after a few conversations, she opened up about how their childhood was anything but the picture-perfect Christian family everyone believed them to be. She told me about the strict rules their parents imposed, about how any sign of doubt or rebellion was punished not just with scolding but with cold silence and emotional withdrawal, and there were stories of shame, of secrets hidden behind closed doors, things that were never discussed because admitting them meant shattering the image of holiness that kept the family together. Aunt Linda shared about their father's harshness and how Ruth was often blamed for things she didn't do, how the pressure to conform crushed her spirit slowly over the years, and hearing all this made me feel both angry and sad, angry at the way my family's silence had kept us apart, and sad for the generations of women who suffered quietly just to keep the peace. The more I learned, the more I realized that my family's religious zeal was less about faith and more about control and fear of abandonment. They were terrified that stepping outside the church meant losing not only God but each other, and that terror was passed down like an invisible chain, binding us all together in a painful, suffocating way. But this knowledge also gave me a new kind of power. It was like I was finally holding the map to a locked room we'd all been afraid to enter. So I began sharing some of these stories with my siblings, starting with Sarah, who surprised me by being more open than I expected. She admitted that she'd had doubts for years but was too scared to speak up because of what it would do to our parents. We talked for hours about how our family's faith felt more like a cage than a comfort, and that conversation sparked something. It broke the silence between us and made me realize that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone in feeling trapped. Jake was harder to reach. He was the golden child, always the most devoted and the one who carried the family's hopes for continuing the faith. But even he started to crack when I gently pressed him about his own struggles, and slowly, over time, he admitted that he too had moments of doubt but buried them deep because he didn't want to disappoint anyone. This was huge, because it meant that the walls of silence were thinner than I thought, but not everyone was ready to face those truths. My parents were still firm in their belief that leaving the church was the ultimate betrayal, and they tried everything to pull me back in, from guilt trips to emotional ultimatums, but I stood my ground. I told them that my journey wasn't about rejecting them but about finding peace for myself, that I loved them even if we saw things differently, and it was painful for all of us. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if I'd lost my family forever, but I also knew that living a lie was no life at all, and amidst the tension and heartbreak, small moments of understanding began to bloom. One afternoon my dad invited me to his workshop, a place I hadn't been since I was a kid, and there, away from the eyes of others, he started telling me about his own struggles with faith, about the loneliness he felt growing up and how religion was the only thing that gave him a sense of belonging, but also how it sometimes made him feel trapped too. It was raw and unexpected. This glimpse into my dad's soul broke through years of distance between us, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hope that we could rebuild something honest. At the same time, I was still wrestling with my own spiritual path. Leaving the church didn't mean I was lost, it meant I was searching, and I found comfort in meditation, in nature, in connecting with people who accepted me without judgment. It was scary to step into the unknown but also freeing in ways I hadn't imagined, and slowly, I saw that my family's story wasn't just about fear and silence but also about love, flawed and complicated, but love nonetheless. And as I shared my journey more openly, I found that the walls started to crack just enough for light to come through. I don't want to lie and say it was easy because it wasn't. There were days filled with tears and anger and moments when I questioned everything, but holding on to the truth, even when it hurt, was the only way forward. And now, looking back on those early days of confrontation and confusion, I see that stepping away from the religion was really stepping towards something greater, a chance to heal old wounds, to break cycles, and to build a family that could embrace all of us, even the parts that scared them most. The hardest part came when I realized that healing my family meant confronting the darkest secret none of us had ever dared speak out loud. It was Aunt Linda who finally pulled me aside during a rare family gathering, her voice trembling when she told me about something that had been buried for nearly 50 years. She said that when my grandmother Ruth was just a young woman, before she was forced into the church by her family, she'd experienced something terrible, a trauma that had shaped the rest of her life but was so shameful and painful it had been locked away with the strict rules and prayers. Hearing that shook me to the core, because suddenly the weight of our family's silence wasn't just about religion or control, it was about protecting each other from unspeakable pain and shame that no one had dared to acknowledge. I pressed Linda to tell me more, and with tears in her eyes, she described how Ruth had been hurt by someone close, someone powerful in their community, and how the family had covered it up, silenced her, told her to pray harder and keep quiet because scandal would ruin them all, and that legacy of forced silence rippled down the generations, explaining so much about why my parents clung so tightly to their faith and why they reacted to my leaving with such fury and fear. This revelation hit like a punch in the gut because it meant that my rebellion wasn't just a personal choice, it was a challenge to a whole system built on fear and secrets. I felt overwhelmed and scared but also determined. I knew I had to face this hidden truth head-on if there was any hope for my family to heal. I started encouraging open conversations during family dinners. Sometimes the tension was unbearable, voices raised, tears falling. But little by little, walls began to crumble. My dad even shared a rare story about his own doubts and regrets and the heavy burden he carried to keep the family together at any cost. And I saw my mom letting go of years of pain and anger as she admitted she'd always felt trapped between wanting to protect us and wanting to break free herself. These moments were raw and messy, and I won't lie, there were days when I wanted to give up, when the silence and rejection felt suffocating, But the small breakthroughs kept me going, like when Sarah told me she'd finally started therapy to deal with the years of guilt she carried for questioning the faith, or when Jake admitted that he'd begun exploring spirituality outside the church too, quietly and afraid but hopeful. And through all this, I learned that faith isn't a simple thing, it's complicated and personal and sometimes painful, and leaving the religion didn't mean abandoning family or love, it meant making space for truth and healing, and I could see that my family was starting to understand that too. It wasn't perfect, there were still setbacks and arguments and moments of heartbreak, but there was also laughter and forgiveness and the beginnings of a new kind of connection, a family that could hold space for each other's wounds and journeys without judgment. And I realized that what I thought was betrayal was actually a chance for all of us to be more honest and human with each other than we ever had been before, and that was worth everything. After months of fragile progress, something unexpected happened that changed everything in ways I couldn't have imagined. My dad, David, invited me to join him for a drive out to a place he hadn't visited in years. It was an old cabin deep in the woods where he'd spent time with my grandfather, the place where so much of their family history had been written in silence. The air was thick with memories and secrets. And as we sat by the fire, he opened up like never before, telling me stories about his childhood, about how the weight of expectations crushed his dreams and how he buried his pain under the armor of faith and duty. He spoke about the fear he carried of losing his family if he ever stepped outside the boundaries set by their religion, and I saw a vulnerability in him I'd never seen before. It was a turning point for us, and I could tell that something inside him had shifted. The walls he'd built around his emotions began to crumble, and he admitted that he was proud of me for having the courage to be true to myself, that he loved me no matter what, and in that moment, I felt the distance between us close a little, and it was healing in a way I hadn't expected. This moment sparked a ripple effect in our family. My mom, too, started opening up about the pressure she felt to keep everything perfect, about the loneliness of living a double life of appearances and hidden pain. She confessed that she'd been afraid of losing us all but was beginning to realize that love could survive even without shared beliefs, and it was breathtaking to witness her transformation. Sarah and Jake also began sharing more honestly about their struggles, and slowly but surely, the entire family started to rewrite our story, one of shame and silence giving way to one of understanding and acceptance. Through all this, I found my own spiritual path blossoming. It was no longer just about leaving something behind but embracing a new way of being that honored my truth and allowed me to love my family as they were, flawed but real. And as I stood on the other side of that long journey, I realized that choosing a different spiritual path hadn't torn us apart, it had brought us closer together in ways I never could have imagined, and maybe that was the greatest blessing of all. Looking back now, I can't believe how far we've come from those early days of silence and fear. The family that once saw my choice as betrayal has slowly become a family that sees me for who I really am. It wasn't an easy path and there were moments when I thought it might never happen, but facing the truth, sharing our pain, and allowing ourselves to be vulnerable has changed everything. My parents no longer demand I return to the church, instead they ask about my life and my beliefs with curiosity and respect. My siblings and I have found new ways to connect beyond religion. We laugh together, argue sometimes, but always with love, and I've learned that faith isn't about blind obedience or fear of rejection, it's about finding peace with yourself and those around you. I also discovered that breaking the cycle of silence and shame was the greatest gift I could give to my family and myself. By speaking out, I freed not just my own soul but theirs too, and that has opened the door to healing that none of us thought possible. So if you're out there feeling lost, isolated, or like you're betraying the people you love because you're seeking your own truth, know that you're not alone, and sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the most beautiful places. Our family story isn't perfect, but it's ours, and it's filled with love, growth, and hope, and I'm grateful every day for the courage to walk away from fear and into the light of understanding. That's my story, and if there's one thing I want you to take away from it, it's that love can survive anything, even when it's tested by the toughest choices, and sometimes, breaking free is the first step to truly coming home. Thanks for watching. If you liked the story, hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more crazy twists. See you in the next one.